y'all. It's Alicia, and welcome back to the Eating Podcast. Y'all, I'm really excited about this week's episode because one thing I love learning about is how we are all being affected by certain things that are dealing with how we eat, our food consumption, the prices of food. Last week we talked about how obesity is still a thing here in the United States and how we still have a ways to go in managing that. And so, as you know, I started this podcast because I love talking about how eating affects us, how food affects us, whether it's a positive or negative thing. We have to have food regardless, right? But this week I was like looking for a topic, trying to figure out, what can I talk about this week? And I came across this article, y'all, and it basically talked about the gentrification of food. And I was like, what? Like, it's one thing to live in a city. Like, I live in New York City, and we see the gentrification happening everywhere here in this city and other cities around the country, and probably on a global scale, where you're seeing just major gentrification moves that are not really helping the people that were originally in that neighborhood to succeed, but it's more so helping those that have money to find, a place to live and raise the cost in those neighborhoods by them pushing out the original people that were in those neighborhoods. And so as I was thinking about that, I was like, okay, I'm thinking about gentrification in that way. But then food, and like I said, I came across this article, and it's called When the Foods That White People Used to Shun Become Trendy. And when I saw that actual title, I was like, whoa, that's intense. Like, what is this about? Right. So, Vina Moore was the person that actually wrote this article, goes down basically the rabbit hole, if you want to call it that, of how gentrification, or food gentrification rather, has been a thing since the beginning of time. And she starts off the article, she starts talking about like things like kale and kale chips, like how kale chips now are like the thing. And they were like the thing, it's been a while, right? But kale, among other vegetables and foods that were out there, were considered, things that only poor Black people ate, slaves to be exact. That was the type of foods that were offered to them. It was basically like the bottom of the barrel type of foods. And even as I thought about that, and after I read this article, I was thinking about other foods that weren't mentioned in this article. And I remember, if you guys haven't seen it, I would encourage you to watch. It is a documentary. It's called High on the Hog, and it talks about the origins of how the African person that was brought over to America, or people rather, not just the person, but the people who have shaped the American food culture. Basically, a lot of those food origins started in Africa. And beyond that, the survival of African people that were brought here enslaved, the way of making a way out of no way. I've always heard that term growing up. You just make a way out of no way. When you were given the scraps, so you were given things like the innards of an animal, particularly things like chitlins. Like, chitlins is still a thing in the Black community. I never grew up eating chitlins because I grew up Adventist and we didn't eat pork, but we did eat certain innards. Like, we ate the tripe, which is basically like the stomach of the cow, liver, gizzards, like things like that were offered to my ancestors. It was still passed down, and those things were still eaten. I ate those things myself growing up. It was just a part of, how we ate. Now, knowing that you don't have to eat those things, you can improve on how you are managing your dietary intake. But that was a part of the dietary means of people back then that were enslaved, or just, poor Black people just trying to make it post slavery too. So, all that to say, I was thinking about not only just chitlins, I was also thinking about foods like, especially talking about the gentrification side of it. Now, chitlins haven't made that mark, unless and if it has, let me know, because I don't know anyone who's out here serving gourmet chitlins. And like I said, if they are, let a girl know, because I've never heard of that. But anyway, I digress. Things like lobster. Lobster was considered a poor man's food. Oysters, also considered a poor man's food. And now we know it is so expensive to purchase either one of those things. And when you do go to restaurants, you see that they are, on the top of the restaurant or menu, right? Crazy amounts of money people spend on things like lobster and oysters and things of that nature. And especially knowing the history of Black people in this country, that was a part of their actual, what they could eat, because that was considered like, the bottom of the barrel at one point. So now seeing and thinking about that, it's like now it does make sense why this article is a thing, because this is like a gentrification thing. Because if you think about places like Harlem, I remember when I moved to New York City, and that was like in 98. Harlem was on the fritz. Like it was, it wasn't somewhere where the everyday white person would want to live. And it was, considered like not a desirable place for, like I said, the average white person. But once people start realizing that the real estate was so cheap, I remember at one point, and listen, at that time too, I barely had two nickels to rub together. I'm just going to keep it real. But if I had the money and I had the means, I would have definitely, jumped on these offers. But at one point, they were selling brownstones. And I remember this, like, because I think they shared this like on the news or something like that, that they were selling brownstones in Harlem for $1. But the agreement on that was if you purchased this brownstone for $1, you had to show that you had money to actually renovate it and a plan in place to renovate these spaces. Well, the majority of people that live in Harlem, particularly then and even some of them now, I mean, like I said, if you've been to Harlem recently or if you've never even been to Harlem, like I said, at one point Harlem wasn't at its best, and now it's so gentrified, it's out of control. But it's kind of doing a weird shift now too. It's a whole, but we'll just stick with the story that where I'm going with right now. But it's so expensive to live in Harlem, even with this other shift that's happening where you're seeing a lot of people that are homeless, but that's by way of gentrification, in my opinion. But yeah, it's so expensive now to live in these spaces that at one point weren't even considered like, it was the undesirable place to be. If you told people at one point, especially early 2000s, late is that you lived in Harlem, or even if you lived in certain parts of Brooklyn, think about that. Like people who live here in New York City, if you're listening to this podcast, I know you're shaking your head like, yeah, yep, yep, and yep. There are places in Brooklyn now that are creme de la creme, but at one point you wouldn't step foot in those neighborhoods because you were afraid of the potential violence, and the fact that the neighborhoods they just weren't that beautiful because of the lack of support that was shown from the city to fix these areas up. And so when you find people who are under a privatized type of situation that can come in, fix these things up, and then raise the prices, and for people who can afford it, particularly, you see a lot of white people who have money in these spaces that can afford it. And so that's where the gentrification comes in. And that's where a lot of the frustration lies when it comes to the residential components of gentrification here in the city. And like I said, across the country. And now we're seeing it, like I said, now, but it's been a thing. But I'm glad this actual article sheds light on not only the residential issues as well as the food issues that we see as it relates to gentrification. In this article, though, she talks about food gentrification and how it goes along with the gentrification of urban neighborhoods. And this is what she said in this area. Because I wanted to kind of like circle back to that so you guys know, like, okay, you're like, where did this come from? So she says here, food gentrification works hand in hand with the gentrification of American cities, where the character of a poor urban area is changed by white and affluent people moving in, improving housing and attracting new businesses, which typically displace poor Black and brown residents in the process. The gentrified neighborhoods often weather redlining and economic disinvestment only to be reinvented, and she puts that in quotes, and also in quotes, revitalized by affluent white people who transform these communities into unrecognizable and unaffordable spaces for longtime Black and brown residents. I know whereof I speak because I live in such an area. And listen, like I said, I mean, it is beyond true. And if you've seen these areas that have been uh quote unquote reinvented and rehabilitated in another quotes, they look beautiful. I mean, you can't deny it, but when you look at the price tag, it's like, who can afford this, right? And when you see that there are people actually occupying these spaces, it's like, oh, that's who can afford it, right? But then on the same token, like the article said, you have these black and brown people who have been there for years, who now cannot afford to live in the neighborhoods that they grew up in. And I know a lot of people who I are good friends with. I have some of my colleagues who are native New Yorkers who talk about this. Like, I grew up in, Morningside Heights. I grew up in Harlem. I grew up in Washington Heights. I grew up in Inwood. I grew up in, Bed-Stuy. I could just go on and on and on. East New York. That's another place that's definitely been completely turned around. I mean, they're still in the works in that area, but I mean, I'm just thinking about all the different areas throughout New York City and the different boroughs. And when you think about it, it's like, wow, like, yeah, even areas in Queens. I don't want to dismiss Queens. Also, even the Bronx. I mean, the Bronx is slowly being gentrified. And I live in the Bronx. I love the Bronx. People always ask me, why do I live in the Bronx? Because I feel like the Bronx is the last place where it feels like real New York. But like I said, slowly but surely, if you're in the, oh gosh, Hunts Point area, I don't know why I was blanking on the area. If you're in the Hunts Point area, Hunts Point is being and has been gentrified, and they're still slowly but surely moving up within the Bronx and actually gentrifying, different areas. So it's a slow process. And I used to joke about this, but it's true. But if you see a Starbucks anywhere, in a neighborhood, it's about to go down. Seriously. Like, once I see that Starbucks, I'm like, yep, it's about to be a whole different ball game in this neighborhood. So y'all go on and get ready, because here it is, right? But as this article goes on, beyond just the neighborhood issues of gentrification, going back to the food situation, one thing that she does talk about in terms of solution based ways of managing food gentrification, she says this. So, the most common solution offered to mitigate food deserts, so that's neighborhoods that lack access to supermarkets that stock fresh produce, and food inequality, and end up exacerbating these problems. So, for instance, she says supermarkets greenlining is the practice of bringing supermarkets into gentrifying neighborhoods where they stock organic and locally produced items at a higher price point. So basically, they feel like this is a solution, but it really is not a solution for the everyday person living in those spaces. It gives people more variety, but then you have to, if you're someone who's living on like a serious budget, you're going into places like Whole Foods. And listen, I shopped there. I try not to shop there as much now, but there are places like that have these price points that are so out of control, where it's just like, how can I possibly afford this? Like, someone who's really on a tight budget, it's impossible. It has changed the scene of the neighborhood as relates to it not being a food desert anymore, but it doesn't allow people to actually be able to afford it that have been there for so long. So she goes on to say they appeal to younger, white, higher income shoppers, talking about these new supermarkets that I was speaking of, as they market themselves as ethical businesses that value the neighborhoods where they are located. Meanwhile, like I said, poor residents are without affordable places to buy groceries. They can't afford to pay $8 for a pint of strawberries. Amen. These residents can be forced to shop at bodegas. So if you don't know what a bodega is, it's basically like a little mom and pop uh, um, like convenience store that sometimes they have produce in these bodegas, sometimes they don't. A lot of times in New York City in particular, they definitely have like different produce produce I can talk produce item. So she says, to shop at like a bodega or a dollar store to sell, packaged foods, and they don't sell fresh produce. So like I said, some bodegas do offer some fresh produce, not always, but sometimes they do. A lot of times you'll see things like plantain, you'll see, or they as a lot of people who are like Dominican and Puerto Rican and of like the Latin American culture, they say platanos. You'll hear that. So that's basically the plantain. So they'll sell things like plantain. They'll sell things. Sometimes they'll sell, bananas. Sometimes you'll see limes and lemons. Sometimes you'll see like papaya. It just depends, but it's very minimal as it relates to fresh produce in these places. So another thing that she brings up, and I thought, yes, I've seen, and you see these all around the city as well. She says another example is when assets like community gardens, and you see these throughout, especially in Harlem. There's one called Harlem Grow or Grow Harlem. It's one of the, and I could be saying that wrong, but established by food advocates to increase food justice and sovereignty for low income BIPOC residents, becoming selling points for real estate agents working in up and coming neighborhoods. Despite community gardens' missions to serve long term residents, they signal to developers that a neighborhood is ready for development. These green spaces wind up appealing to the sensibilities of white, affluent potential residents, which only perpetuates gentrification. And when I read that, I was like, wow, I didn't even think that these like these community gardens, would be this detrimental to those actual neighborhoods. I thought it would be a good thing. And I think it is still a good thing. I'm not taking away from the fact that these gardens are there and that they are helping not only to support the community with produce, and fresh fruits and vegetables and things like that, but it's also teaching the people in the neighborhood, particularly like the children, how to grow things. So there are benefits to it, but like as you can see, there's also a huge risk of having them in the neighborhoods as well. Especially when people are thinking in that mindset of, oh, this is a area we can develop, let's go for it. And it's like, wow, that's really eye opening. She goes on to say, additionally, food organizations that operate at a profit are more likely to contribute to green gentrification, as they must answer to the needs of the more affluent residents who support pays their bills. She goes on to say, how do we combat food gentrification? So CUNY, which is the City Universities of New York Urban Food Policy Institute, centers on hyper-local strategies such as paying attention to local food policy and zoning regulations, participating in neighborhood planning meetings, supporting organizations fighting for affordable housing, and lobbying city agencies involved in economic development. She goes on to say, and this is at the end of the article, she says, these strategies take a lot of time and effort, which I, as well as many other people who need to work two jobs to make ends meet, don't have. While having a package of kale chips on the shelf seems an inadequate solution to the problem, it's the easiest thing at my disposal that I can do. Grocers won't stock items that don't sell. Perhaps if more people stopped buying gentrified versions of food, that oppressors co-opt from BIPOC, marginalized communities would experience true food justice. And listen, this article, I picked a few things out of it, but I just thought this was so interesting how she tied in the gentrification component to food justice. It was just wild to me because I never put the two together. But I think it's so important for us to understand that this is a thing, right? And as much as, you know, marketing can like, make things look so glamorous and like, oh, look, check out these new kale chips, blah, 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 that are, 10.99. Meanwhile, you might, at best get 20 good kale chips and the rest at the bottom are like crumbs. I know this because I've purchased kale chips in the past. It's not helping the true situation and really talking or speaking to the fact that a lot of these foods, like I mentioned earlier in the conversation, a lot of these foods were considered undesirable at one point. Same with these neighborhoods. They were undesirable at one point. And so it's like, how do we come together to really take away the greed out of people having access, and I mean all people, having access to good food, a nice place to live, an affordable, nice place to live, and also have adequate education in every neighborhood? Like, how do we get to that point? I mean, this is not, I don't have all the answers, but it's something to think about because it's like, it's all fun and games when we're seeing all these cool marketing things, like I said, about things like the kale chips Or we go to these fancy restaurants and the lobster is, 50, $60. Meanwhile, at one point you couldn't give them away. So it's like really keeping in mind how the tides change. And even when it comes to the neighborhood, I'm coming back full circle as it relates to Harlem. Right now, if you've been to Harlem in the past month or so, maybe even before that, I'll go even to COVID. We'll start with COVID. How about that? If you were in Harlem 2020, 21 up to now, you've seen the changes. And while the prices haven't gone down, the neighborhoods are definitely going down. And so that begs me to then question, will Harlem maintain that beautification, that gentrification that was once there? Because it seems like it's going completely back to where it was before, where you could only where the brown stores were $1 to purchase, and it was the undesirable neighborhood. So the question is like, will this tide change? And with the tides changing, will it allow for people to be able to afford a nice place to live? Will the neighborhoods be maintained, or will this be the great white migration again, right? And white people leave these spaces and not support these spaces, and they go back to rubble and looking a hot mess. And not only were the people that were living in those neighborhoods all their lives, they've been displaced and have maybe moved to another state, moved upstate, moved out of the city. But then it's like those neighborhoods are then left to be desolate. Who knows? I don't know. I think about that all the time, especially when I do go to Harlem, because like I said, it's not getting any better. I think it looks pretty rough over there. I'm gonna keep it real. And I love New York City. Like, I love New York, which is why another reason why it was pressing on my heart to talk about the food gentrification, as well as what is happening in terms of gentrification and the damage that gentrification has caused on so many levels in this city. We have to address it. I don't, like I said, I don't have all the answers, but I think if more people come together and start talking about it and really being serious about the fact that New York City is, I mean, it's beyond it. Expensive is not even the word. It's ridiculous. Okay. Like, it's full on ridiculous. Like, you cannot survive here without either having a partner. Like, I'm married. And we're barely getting by. I'm just gonna keep it real. We live comfortable for New York standards, but I would like to have more money in the bank. I would like to be able to do more things, but with all the prices going up and now all this stuff with the tariffs and all this stuff, that's a whole other thing to tack on to the everyday person in this country. So there's a lot of things to think about. And I think if anything, we need to start really focusing on as how we can help each other as a community versus just trying to go to the latest and greatest thing and be the new face of kale chips or be the new face of Harlem or whatever that looks like, right? Creating community and supporting one another and not constantly looking for some type of profitable gain. I think that's where a lot of our minds should be going, because like I said, this is not sustainable. How we're living, how I'm just speaking for New York because this is where I live, how New York has catapulted into making all this change in the city, only to see, I mean, if you know anything about New York, a lot of these buildings that they have built up, in these gentrified areas, a lot of these apartments are empty. No one's living in these spaces. So it's like, okay, you have all these expensive price points, but eventually it's going to be a point where you know people just can't afford it. Like, it's cute when you first get these places, but after a while you're forking out $5,000 a month for rent, for a 2 bedroom, maybe sometimes even 1 bedrooms, $3,000-$4,000 a month. And it's like, okay, what am I doing? Like, what? $5,000? This is crazy. Pay your $5,000 a month for rent. You got your other, things that you have to pay for. Then you tackle on the food prices, which, I mean, hello, how can you live? How can you survive? And so it's like we have to start thinking beyond, like I said, these trendy things that, keep popping up in our faces, and figure out how we can sustain life, how we can live a happier life and not trying to constantly be on the latest, popular train. So something to think about. I will share this article in the show notes because I think it's super, super important to read it all the way through. I just hit a few highlights in the article, but definitely take a look at it. And then, let's start a conversation if you're interested in like talking about how we can actually create more change around having more of affordable ways of living. I would love to do that. I think it's important that we support each other, especially in these life and times. Like there's a lot of uncertainty. A lot of people are nervous and stressed out how they're just going to make it each and every day. So I'm open to that. And yeah, let's get it going. And who knows? We can, from this one podcast episode, we can make some big changes. I don't know, but I feel like there's something that needs to be done and said. So yeah, y'all. Like I said, I'll share all the information in the show notes. I love y'all. And like I always say, let's just keep on keeping on. And I will see y'all next week. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Eating Podcast. Love you. Bye.